Before Normandy, before D-Day, before the Western Allies dared return to Europe, 5,000 Canadians stormed a fortified Nazi port under moonlight and machine gun fire. They were promised air cover, surprise, and support. They received death. By sunrise, the beach was littered with bodies. German bunkers still stood, and nearly 60% of the attacking force was dead, wounded, or captured. In Washington, one Allied commander saw something darker than failure. General Dwight D. Eisenhower would later privately accuse Britain of lacking the will to fight and of sacrificing others to avoid bloodshed. This is not a myth. This is not propaganda. This is the story of Dieppe, delay, and betrayal, from France to the Balkans, to the moment the Allied alliance nearly fractured under the weight of its own fear. At 4:50 a.m., the first Canadian landing craft scraped against the stones of Dieppe Beach. There was no surprise. German searchlights snapped on. Machine guns opened fire from concrete emplacements carved into the cliffs. The planners had assumed tanks could roll off the beach. They couldn't. The shingle jammed their tracks. Men were cut down before reaching cover. In less than 6 hours, the raid was over. Out of nearly 5,000 Canadians, over 3,300 became casualties. Churchill would later call Dieppe a necessary test. But inside Allied headquarters, the lesson was interpreted differently. For the Americans, especially Eisenhower, Dieppe proved that Britain had no intention of leading a direct assault on Fortress Europe. Instead, they would test theories with other men's lives. The Germans didn't just repel the attack, they filmed it, and Berlin broadcast the footage as proof that the Western Allies were not ready to fight.
After Dieppe, British commanders doubled down on delay. They argued that a cross-channel invasion was impossible until overwhelming superiority was achieved. Every failure, they claimed, justified waiting another year. But while Britain waited, the Soviet Union bled. By the end of 1942, Stalingrad was consuming entire German armies. Millions of Soviet soldiers and civilians were dead. Stalin demanded a second front and received excuses. Eisenhower, newly appointed Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, was caught between diplomacy and rage. Privately, he complained that British strategy risked losing the war by refusing to fight it. He would later describe British leadership as overcautious to the point of paralysis, unwilling to accept casualties unless Americans or others bore the cost. The Western Front was quiet, but elsewhere, men were dying because London had asked them to.
While Britain delayed in the West, it urged resistance elsewhere. In the Balkans, the Royal Yugoslav Army and Chetnik forces were encouraged to sabotage German supply lines feeding Rommel's Afrika Korps. They did. Rail lines were blown, convoys were ambushed, German fuel never reached North Africa. The price was catastrophic. For every German soldier killed, Nazis executed up to 100 civilians in reprisal. Entire villages vanished overnight. Still, London pressed them to fight. Then in 1943, everything changed. British intelligence decided the Yugoslavs weren't killing Germans fast enough. Instead, Britain shifted support to Josip Broz Tito, a communist leader more politically aligned with British post-war interests. The Royal Yugoslav Army, once praised, was cut off, discredited, and abandoned. To Eisenhower, this confirmed his darkest fear.
Britain did not fight wars to win battles, it fought them to control outcomes.
By early 1943, Eisenhower was no longer just a general. He was a mediator inside a fractured alliance. At every major planning meeting, the same conflict resurfaced. The Americans wanted France. The British insisted on anywhere but France. Churchill argued that another Dieppe would be catastrophic. Britain, he said, could not survive another bloodbath like 1916. Instead, he proposed indirect war, North Africa, then Italy, the soft underbelly of Europe. Eisenhower disagreed. In private correspondence and staff discussions, he accused British planners of strategic avoidance, prolonging the war while others paid the price. He believed delay strengthened Germany and exhausted the Soviet Union. Yet Eisenhower compromised, not because he agreed, but because unity mattered more than pride. The result was a campaign that satisfied politics, not urgency. The Allies would strike, but not where it mattered most.
The Allied invasion of Sicily was massive, well-planned, and successful on paper. But Sicily did not break Germany. As Allied troops pushed north, Hitler simply pulled his best divisions back into mainland Italy. The campaign that followed became a grinding war of mountains, rivers, and fortified lines. Monte Cassino, Salerno, Anzio. Each name became synonymous with attrition. Eisenhower later admitted that Italy consumed divisions and time that should have been used to open the Western Front earlier. The British objective had been achieved. Germany was pressured without risking a decisive confrontation in France, but the cost was staggering. Thousands died for ground that meant little strategically. The war dragged on, and in the East, the Red Army continued to absorb the shock of the Wehrmacht almost alone. Delay had consequences.
When Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin finally met face to face, the tension was unmistakable. Stalin was blunt. Since 1941, the Soviet Union had lost millions. Entire cities had been erased, yet the promised Second Front had not materialized. He accused the Western Allies, particularly Britain, of deliberately letting the USSR bleed. Churchill deflected. Roosevelt smoothed tensions. Eisenhower, watching from the military side, knew the truth was uncomfortable. Stalin was right about one thing. The delay was no longer defensible. At Tehran, the decision was forced. A cross-channel invasion would happen in 1944. The argument was over, but the damage to trust was permanent.
As the Western Allies finalized plans for Normandy, the Balkans were quietly written off. British supply drops to Royal Yugoslav forces dwindled. Radio support faded. Intelligence channels closed. Tito's communist partisans now received weapons, recognition, and legitimacy. The message was clear. Loyalty mattered less than political convenience. German reprisals intensified. Villages suspected of supporting the old resistance were annihilated. Fighters who had answered Britain's call were left isolated and hunted. Eisenhower did not control Balkan policy, but he saw its implications. The Allies had won strategically and lost morally. The war was being shaped not only by who fought hardest, but by who would rule afterward.
By the winter of 1944, Eisenhower had had enough. Operation Overlord would proceed, with or without unanimous enthusiasm. Troops flooded into southern England. Landing craft filled the harbors. Airfields buzzed night and day. There would be no Dieppe-style rehearsal, no limited raid. This time the Allies would land to stay. Eisenhower accepted the risk Britain feared, because delay now meant defeat. The accusation that once echoed privately, cowardice, hesitation, betrayal of momentum, no longer mattered. History would judge by action. And on June 6, 1944, the argument ended on the beaches of Normandy.
At dawn, the invasion Britain had feared and Eisenhower had demanded finally began. Across 5 beaches, Allied troops assaulted the Atlantic Wall under fire from artillery, mortars, and machine guns. Unlike Dieppe, there would be no withdrawal. At Omaha Beach alone, American units were nearly destroyed in the first hours. Entire companies were pinned down. Officers were killed before issuing orders. But the men did not pull back. Small groups climbed the bluffs, silenced German positions, and cracked the defense from within. By nightfall, the Allies held Normandy soil. Eisenhower's gamble had succeeded, not because losses were avoided, but because they were accepted. The beach that Britain feared became the proof Eisenhower needed. The Western Front was finally open.
After Normandy, British leaders quietly reframed Dieppe. The raid was now described as a necessary learning experience, a test that revealed the dangers of premature invasion. Eisenhower disagreed. The lessons of Dieppe had been obvious before the first man landed. Inadequate intelligence, frontal assault against fortified ports, and no sustained follow-up. Normandy succeeded not because Dieppe happened, but because its mistakes were rejected. Ports were bypassed, air superiority was absolute, and above all, there was no plan to retreat. The implication was uncomfortable. Dieppe had not failed because invasion was impossible. It failed because commitment was missing.
While the Western Allies debated, the Red Army fought for survival. By the time of D-Day, the Soviet Union had destroyed the bulk of Germany's field armies. Cities like Leningrad and Stalingrad had endured unimaginable suffering. Civilian casualties numbered in the millions. Soviet commanders never forgot the delay. From their perspective, Britain's refusal to open a second front earlier was not caution, it was calculation. Eisenhower understood this resentment. He knew the political balance of post-war Europe had already shifted, not because of ideology, but because time had been surrendered. The map of Europe was being drawn in blood long before diplomats arrived.
The Allied armies pushed across France and Belgium. Cooperation improved, but trust did not fully return. British forces fought bravely in Normandy, Market Garden, and the Rhineland. No accusation questioned their courage at the soldier level. Eisenhower's criticism was never about British troops. It was about strategic will. The war in the West ended faster than expected, but the East would decide who liberated whom and who ruled afterward. When the Allies finally linked up with Soviet forces in Germany, the shape of post-war Europe was already set. Delay had reshaped the world.
Eisenhower never publicly denounced Britain, but in private ridings and conversations, his frustration remained clear. He believed wars were won by decisive engagement, not managed risk, that alliances fractured when fear dictated strategy, and that delay, even when justified, always carried a moral cost. The accusation of cowardice was never spoken in speeches. It lived in decisions, memoranda, and the silent acknowledgement of what might have been different. World War II ended in victory, but the fractures exposed by Dieppe, Yugoslavia, and delayed invasion
would echo far beyond 1945 into the Cold War that followed.
With France liberated, British commanders proposed one final gamble, Operation Market Garden. The plan was bold. Airborne forces would seize bridges deep inside German territory, allowing ground forces to race into the Ruhr and end the war by Christmas. But the caution Eisenhower had long criticized resurfaced in a different form: optimism without sufficient force. Intelligence warnings about German armor near Arnhem were downplayed. Airborne troops were dropped miles from objectives. Relief columns moved slower than planned. British paratroopers at Arnhem fought for days, isolated, surrounded, and eventually overwhelmed. Market Garden failed. To Eisenhower, it reinforced a pattern. When Britain acted aggressively, it did so without committing enough strength to ensure success.
As Allied forces paused to reorganize, Hitler struck back. The Battle of the Bulge exploded through thinly held American lines. German armor surged westward under cover of snow and fog. Eisenhower responded decisively. Reserves were rushed forward. Command structures were unified. No ground was abandoned without a fight. The contrast was stark. Where delay had once defined Allied caution, speed and commitment now dictated survival. The German offensive was stopped at enormous cost, but permanently. For Eisenhower, the lesson was settled. Wars are not won by avoiding risk. They are won by managing it through action.
As German forces retreated from the Balkans, Tito's partisans emerged victorious, armed, organized, and politically legitimized. The Royal Yugoslav Army, once Britain's ally, was shattered. Officers were executed. Monarchists were imprisoned or exiled. Western influence vanished overnight. Britain had achieved short-term military utility, but surrendered long-term influence. Eisenhower recognized the pattern repeating across Eastern Europe. Where Allied armies did not arrive in time, others would decide the future. Delay had consequences that tanks could not reverse.
April 1945, Elbe River, Germany. When American and Soviet forces finally met at the Elbe, the war was nearly over. The handshake was historic, but uneasy. The Red Army had taken Berlin. Eastern Europe was already under Soviet control. No negotiation could change that. Eisenhower understood what this meant. The line between liberation and occupation had been drawn not by ideology, but by timing. The West had arrived too late.
After the war, Churchill spoke openly, but only in private. He acknowledged that delay had shaped the post-war world, that fear of losses had limited Britain's ability to act decisively, and that the Soviet advance could not be undone. Publicly, Britain celebrated victory. Privately, its leaders knew the cost of caution. Eisenhower would later reflect that Britain fought World War II with one eye on survival and one on empire. The war had been won, but not on Britain's terms.
Eisenhower never wrote a manifesto condemning Britain. He never delivered a speech accusing allies of betrayal. Instead, he let decision speak. As Supreme Allied Commander and later President, he favored decisive commitment, shared risk, and action over delay. The accusation that once circulated privately, cowardice, hesitation, betrayal of momentum, faded into history. But its consequences did not. World War II ended with victory and a divided Europe that reflected every month the Allies waited to fight.
Eisenhower's criticism of Britain was never about fear in combat. British soldiers fought with distinction at El Alamein, Normandy, Arnhem, and the Rhine.
Their courage was never questioned. What Eisenhower challenged was decision-making at the highest level. He believed Britain's leadership, shaped by the trauma of World War I and the limits of empire, prioritized preservation over resolution, survival over confrontation. In Eisenhower's view, this mindset delayed victory and shifted the burden of destruction elsewhere. The accusation was not cowardice of man, but hesitation of power.
Was Yugoslavia betrayed or sacrificed to necessity? From London's perspective, Tito's forces were more effective against German units by 1943. Supporting them shortened the war. From Eisenhower's perspective, abandoning loyal allies who had followed British orders and paid in civilian blood crossed a moral line. History offers no clean verdict, but the pattern is clear. Those who fought when asked and were no longer useful were discarded. War rewards effectiveness, not loyalty.
By 1945, Europe was divided not by ideology alone, but by arrival time. Where American and British armies liberated, democracies were rebuilt, sovereignty returned. Where they arrived too late, communist governments took root, borders hardened, the Iron Curtain followed the calendar. Eisenhower understood this before the war ended. Every postponed landing, every diverted campaign, every month of delay had written borders that tanks could not erase.
The Allied victory of 1945 was total, but incomplete. Germany was defeated, Nazism destroyed. Yet the alliance that won the war dissolved almost immediately. Suspicion replaced cooperation. Former allies became adversaries. Eisenhower would later warn against repeating this pattern. Alliances weakened by fear, fractured by delay, and undone by distrust. The Cold War was not inevitable, but it was made more likely by the choices of World War II.
As president, Eisenhower governed differently than his allies had fought. He avoided reckless wars, but rejected paralysis. He built alliances, but insisted on shared risk. He warned against military complacency and political fear. The memory of delayed action haunted him. World War II taught Eisenhower that hesitation could be as destructive as defeat, and that leadership meant choosing when delay saves lives and when it costs them.
History does not judge alliances by intentions, but by outcomes. Dieppe exposed fear of commitment. Yugoslavia revealed the cost of abandonment. Normandy proved what decisive action could achieve. Eisenhower never needed to accuse Britain publicly. The map of post-war Europe became the evidence. World War II was won, but the shape of the peace was decided by who chose to fight and win.
Thank you for watching. If you value in-depth World War II documentaries grounded in historical debate, consider subscribing to support the channel.